maybe we could start off, Ed, if you could just, tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up as like the Broda Traversa guy.
The easiest way to describe it, if you have to live in a wheelchair, these are the ones that you want to live in.
All right, well, it's great to see everyone again. I'm joined here with Ed Bandas. Ed is like the guy for the Traversa, the Broda Traversa chair. I always run into this at trade shows like NEMT, at TTA. I'm walking around, I see a big crowd of people around a booth, and as I look over, it's the Broda booth. Ed's there. He's got somebody sitting in the Broda chair. He's like folding it up, he's folding it down. People are oohing and awing, and I thought, man, I've gotta have Ed join us and talk to us because, in terms of like word of mouth products in NEMT, the Traversa chair has got to be one of the top things that people talk about and are excited about. And I think that one of the big reasons for that is it's a way to sort of get into stretcher trips with a sort of much lower lift than the traditional sort of expensive, high training, high insurance sort of stretcher option. And so real excited to have Ed on, as I said, just to talk a little bit about, how you can use this to get into the stretcher industry. And, oh, by the way, I'm James O'Donnell. I'm one of the co-founders of Duet. We're a dispatching software company, but we love to have people who are experts in various aspects of NEMT come on and sort of share their knowledge with everybody because we spend tons of time talking to NEMT owners.
Howard Berkowitz just jumped on, and so did Michael.
Hey,
there's a couple of experts right
Howard,
there.
Michael, James, good to see everybody. So maybe we could start off, Ed, if you could just, tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up as like the Broda Traversa guy.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at my background, it has nothing to do with wheelchairs and transport. It was something else. It was, I started off from the military and then got into medical sales, back in the mid-90s. And I was fortunate and blessed enough to come along with a company called Broda, which has been around now for about 45 years. Their specialty has always been in the long-term care market with clinical wheelchairs that are used. The easiest way to describe it, if you have to live in a wheelchair, these are the ones that you want to live in. And a couple of years ago, we made the commitment to go all in on the NEMT side. We have had crash-tested chairs that we built since 2011, but we've never been in the commercial space of the NEMT world. It was just operators found us, they started using our chairs, and the feedback that we got was extremely positive. And a lot of those guys were able to find a niche in the non-emergency medical transportation business using Broda chairs. So we took the next step to develop the Traversa, which is a commercial grade version of what we've already been doing for many, many years. And I just happened to be one of the guys that really enjoyed doing the research as we were coming to market with it. As I tell anybody who's talked to me, I tend to geek out on the numbers and the literature. I keep folders of source documents for everything that we talk about, so that way I can show anybody who's going to geek out as much as I do about this stuff. But I've just really enjoyed watching this entire industry transform with this essentially a new space that falls in between a wheelchair and a stretcher, and that's where we fit.
That's awesome, and I can see the other James in the comments is already saying, hey, I use the Traversa and I love it. So let me ask you, could you maybe give us sort of the high-level view for people who haven't seen it in person? Like, what is the Traversa chair? What does it do?
So the Traversa is really designed to fit the space between a wheelchair and a stretcher. In the past, if somebody could not sit in a wheelchair for any reason, there was only one option. You go to a stretcher. They may not need a stretcher. They're medically stable. They're just bed bound. They just don't have the strength to sit in a wheelchair for whatever reason. Discharges from hospitals, we found out oftentimes they were sent home in a stretcher because they didn't have a wheelchair that was issued to that particular patient. And in fact, we've heard anecdotally where you could sit there and watch somebody being wheeled out in a wheelchair, they stand up, they physically transfer themselves, lay down in the stretcher, and then go home in the stretcher. Well, that makes no fiscal or physical sense whatsoever. And
Sometimes
but
that's
in
like the $1,500 ambulance taking them home in the stretcher, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly, we were talking about that earlier, is the cost of that is just totally unnecessary in many cases. In the non-emergency world, we know that about 90% of those non-emergency trips did not have to be a stretcher, they just couldn't be a wheelchair. And so by being able to bridge that gap with something that is both economical in the sense of the investment versus a stretcher, economical in the sense that you can use half of the labor to do it, one person instead of two people, but you still keep the convenience of being able to put somebody into the chair, while also bringing the whole center of gravity down, and a simple wheelchair van it'll secure easily. It's just much more convenient, both from the discharge facility and the receiving facility, in this space.
Awesome. So let's zoom out for a second.
Sure.
I'm often talking to owners who say, "Look, James, I do ambi, I do wheelchair. I'd like to do stretcher, but you know, haven't really gotten around to it yet." Why even bother getting into stretcher? Like, what do reimbursements look like for stretcher versus wheelchairs?
No, that's a great question, because so much of what we do is reimbursement driven. In many cases, we know that reimbursement for wheelchairs typically falls somewhere in the middle two digits. $50, $75 is a pickup fee plus the mileage fee that's involved. Stretcher work is much more regional in nature. It can be anywhere from $200 pickup fee to $1,500. It depends on the location. We've seen states where ambulances will charge $1,500 to take somebody to dialysis and back. And they have to use two people, the full crew, ambulance, everything, just to take somebody to a routine appointment 3 times a week. That starts adding up extremely fast. And again, it's just a misuse of the resources that could go to something else, not to mention the fact that if you're using emergency services, like in a lot of places where it's actually first responders who have to do those non-emergency trips, you're either taking an ambulance out of circulation that could be used for an emergency, or the ambulance is going to be called to an emergency and leave the non-emergency patient behind to potentially miss whatever health care appointment they may have, which ultimately ends up costing the system more also.
Yeah, yeah, and I've seen many people, for example, out in California, who are doing stretcher trips, and easily they can make $1,500, $2,000 on a good day with a stretcher vehicle, whereas like a wheelchair vehicle can be pretty tough to get above $1,000, at least in some of these Southern California markets. So you can see there's definitely a lot of value there, and there's many people who are bedbound and need transport. So I wanted to ask you, Ed, obviously the Traversa is a little bit different than a full stretcher. How many bedbound patients can be transported by the Traversa, and sort of what is the difference between the people who can be and those who can't be?
That's a great question. I think that in a newer market where you're bringing a Traversa in for the first time and they've never seen one before, I think proper triage is really going to be the key. Whoever the transportation provider is needs to do a little education of the facilities to make sure that they understand what it is. Oftentimes we've seen some of our transportation providers literally just walk in with a chair, go talk to the case managers and the discharge planners, and once they understand what it is, it's usually not much of a pushback after that, especially if they can see it's lower cost and a heck of a lot more convenient. Typically wheelchair vans they have a much shorter ETA and help discharge people faster. So it's usually not much of a pushback, but it does take a good selection process, a triage, whenever you get the ticket for that ride, to make sure that you're taking the proper person. If you've got somebody who's extremely obese, or a pretty acute problem with spinal cord injury or something like that, then chances are they do need the stability of an actual stretcher. But in most cases, as I tell some of our operators, what's the first thing you do when you're using a stretcher? You transfer somebody in, what's the very next thing that happens? Well, you sit them up to make them more comfortable. Well, no kidding, right? So why not use a chair that was built to do that, and you have much more variability in your positioning for that person, and they're far more comfortable, especially if you're doing long transports or discharges or something like that. Post-operative transports also, when you can position them in infinite number of ways to make them more comfortable. Once the discharge planners and the case managers understand that, and they understand the versatility that they can get by using something like a Traversa or calling one of the providers that has a Traversa, I think that usually ends up kind of snowballing on itself as well.
And I've heard it's something like 90% of bedbound patients can be transported with a Traversa. Is that right?
Yeah, and when I look at strictly, and we've heard this from several of our providers too, anytime you have a non-emergency, and we'll always specify non-emergency. If it's an emergency, go by ambulance, man. You're going to need it. But non-emergency trips where the patient could not go by wheelchair, they just didn't really need a stretcher other than they just couldn't sit in a wheelchair. And so if you can deploy less resources and make them more comfortable by using something like the Traversa, we think there's an advantage in so many ways. And about 90% of the time, as I mentioned before, you didn't need the stretcher, you just couldn't use a wheelchair. We talk about sometimes like, I always put myself in the position of a patient. You're bedbound, you're getting picked up to go to a doctor's appointment, and that's all you're going to do. How do you want to go out the door? Do you want to go with paramedics and a big stretcher with all of their crash bags and everything hanging off of it, and folks, your fellow residents are already divvying up your stuff in your room because they think you're not coming back? That's a little running joke, by the way. Or would you rather just go out in a dignified manner with a driver in something like a Traversa where you're tilted back, you're reclined, you're comfortable, and it's a lot less fuss over that transport. And frankly, it seems to be easier for the staff involved who have to help do the transfer into that chair as well. So, there's a lot of advantages from that perspective too.
That's a great point with making it easier for the facility staff, for example. How do you, like, if I'm an NEMT owner that's, wanting to go in and, start doing Traversa trips, and if, facility calls me, hey, can you do stretcher trips? How should I explain what my capabilities are if I've got a Traversa but not a traditional stretcher?
I think that's twofold. What we've heard our providers talking about is basically teaching them, hey, let me show you what we do for these stretcher trips, and let us show you what our response time is and our costs are. In most cases, if you can get the audience with the right people who are making the determination on that transport, in most cases it's not too hard to win that over. But it does take a little bit of education if they haven't seen it before. We're in an interesting position now where 2 years ago when we came to market, to coin a military term, where we went loud. In other words, it wasn't just we sell a chair, some of these providers buy it and they use it in their own little niche markets, but now we're going, very public with this. 2 years ago, we were making outbound calls trying to get people to listen to us. And we started showing up at NEMT. We started doing our education of the providers. In the last 2 years now, we're in the position where it's become, I'm not going to say mainstream, but it's, as the kids would say, it's kind of a thing now. And so we have
it, like a broker, any broker is familiar with the Broda Traversa chair.
Oh, absolutely. We have customers that are coming back for more. We have customers that are buying because their competitors across town have them, and that's a good position to be in. It means that it validates the premise that there is this this gap in between the wheelchair and the stretcher that can be filled a lot easier, and really help these providers find a new market and a new niche where they can potentially get more revenue from those rides without having to have the expenditure of a full box ambulance, 2 people, paying EMTs, and everything that goes along with that. We've had some folks that are very, very successful in their niche markets that are not so niche anymore. It's becoming much more of an accepted category in transportation.
And do you see people typically price a Traversa trip the same as a stretcher trip, or do people come in a little lower as a way to sort of get more business because they're able to be in and out quicker?
That's a great question. And one of the analogies that we talked about earlier, it's kind of like, how much does a house cost? Well, a house in Florida is going to cost different than a house in Iowa or Texas or whatever. So there's a lot of regionality in the pricing and in those pricing models. But generally speaking, we hear of our providers charging anywhere from that range in between a stretcher and a wheelchair, somewhere in, the halfway mark or a little bit more. We have some providers that are getting the full stretcher reimbursement while they're just using one driver in a Traversa. And in those places, I think that's where the value has really shown through because, as we talked about earlier, the ETA for an ambulance to come pick up somebody for a discharge is generally going to be much longer than the ETA for a non-emergency transportation provider to show up with a wheelchair van that can just happen to do this type of a transport with a Traversa.
Yeah, and to follow along with that, what sort of markets do you see where you can really charge the full stretcher price with the Traversa?
That's a great question. We see where people have really pioneered the use of Traversa and being able to get extra revenue is going to be in discharges from facilities, especially facility to facility transport, long distance transports. Anybody who's gone more than 30 minutes in a stretcher or just a fold-up wheelchair can tell you they're not comfortable, and by us being able to position the patient however they want, we've heard from everybody that it's a far more comfortable ride. So long-distance trips, discharges, we've heard everything as novel as imaging. When you have to take a patient to imaging, oftentimes, how do you lift a patient from a wheelchair over to an imaging table if you didn't get an ambulance to do it on a stretcher? Oftentimes that's really painful, but for us to be able to raise up to the level of a table and slide somebody over, even though it was a wheelchair ride to begin with, that's been really positive. We've had instances where people have used Traversas to go to dental appointments, and where the transportation provider can actually take them in, charge a loiter fee, not even transfer them out of the chair. They take care of whatever medical necessities they have, and then they leave again.
Oh, that's
At
nice.
no point, you've eliminated so many points of risk when you're trying to transfer somebody in and out of a chair or on and off a stretcher. If you can leave them in there and charge a loiter fee and eliminate all that risk, that's a pretty good deal for the payers also. And I think one of the interesting notes that we've had, again anecdotally, is we have not heard of any incidents where somebody has been injured while in one of our chairs, whether it's our previous model or the Traversa chair. I made that claim in front of a broker that came to our booth at one of these meetings where we've seen each other, and I had one of our very valued NEMT accredited transportation providers standing next to me, and I made this big claim. Nobody's ever been hurt in a Broda before, but don't believe me, ask that guy right there. And he confirmed it. He said he'd been using Broda chairs for 4 years and has never had a reportable incident where, especially on reportable incidents where you can claw back money from the facilities, where they lose money if somebody gets injured during that transport. And so that alone has endeared us to a lot of the administrators in nursing homes and things like that. Hey, they're safe, they're comfortable, we get higher ratings, and it's costs us a little bit more to transport, but man, we're not getting killed on the clawback and
Right.
things like that. So there's a lot of advantages to it.
Oh, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about conventional stretchers and sort of, could you walk me through some of the reasons why it's so tough to jump from like wheelchair transport to a conventional stretcher transport?
Sorry, I just saw Howard mention something, create another level of mobility service. And Howard's point is actually very valid because I know that we've been working with, and I'll come back to your question. I'm sorry about that. That he made a really good point there. Working with the brokers, working with NEMT and some of the other agencies to help define what that level of service is. Whether you call it enhanced service of some form or whatever, once we can define it and create a reimbursement mechanism for it, I think you'll see the entire industry be lifted from that alone in terms of the quality of transport and the satisfaction and the, whatever surveys you get after that. So
NEMT should get to work.
they've been working on it. I can vouch for that. As Howard can attest, I think Howard was actually my instructor when I was getting certified in
wow.
some of the different NEMT courses because I figured I need to be certified if I'm talking about it. So he's a good teacher. I'm plugging him right here, by the way. So anyway, and see, there you go, best student ever. Thank you. So, anyway, James, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I
Of
started
course.
rambling there a bit.
So I was just asking, what are some of the challenges that, you run into trying to jump from a traditional wheelchair setup to a traditional stretcher setup?
So the challenges are if you're a provider and you've only done wheelchairs before, like anything else, you're getting outside of your normal business model. Where am I going to find the business to be able to upcharge for the investment that I'm going to make in this particular device? Because, the Traversa chair is not an inexpensive wheelchair, but it's also only about 1/3 of the price of a stretcher. So it makes a lot of sense if you can do 90% of the trips with this chair that only costs 1/3 as much. It behooves you to learn from other folks in the industry. That's one thing I've found is that when you go to a lot of these conferences, participate in NEMT, participate in Transportation Alliance, there are folks that will be happy to help you and walk you through if you're not competitive with them. We've talked to a lot of folks that are happy to tell you what their business model is and give you some ideas on the messaging, give you some ideas on who to talk to. Because I think once you understand it and you can explain it to the correct audience, I think that that's the biggest challenge. Because the flip side of that is, we can attest to the fact that we've had a couple of customers buy one of our Traversas and then call us back 3 or 4 months later and say, hey, we want to return this thing. And when we say, what's going on? Well, the brokers aren't calling me. Well, the brokers aren't going to call you. You have to go find your business. We're happy to tell you everything that we know about that and give you some ideas that we've learned from some of our customers, put you in touch with some customers, and everybody learn from each other. You can talk to folks like we're just talking about, like Howard here, or, there's a lot of people out there that you can talk to that will help you find that niche to make you profitable. I'll always give the example. There's a particular town in the state where I live where there's 2 main operators. One of them is just doing strictly broker work as cheap as it comes with, completely ragged out old vans. They have drivers that are smoking cigarettes with the windows down while they're transporting people. And then we have somebody else that's doing very high quality work and they happen to be running a handful of our older Broda chairs. And guess who has the exclusive contract with the hospice hospital involved? That's extremely profitable. I mean, you get what you pay for, but you didn't get that just because you bought some chairs. You did that because you understood their place in the marketplace and you went out and hustled a little bit of business. Again, that's where I love what I do, because I get to talk to a lot of these transportation providers all over the country, and I'm able to piece together ideas from some of the best minds in the industry. And it's fun, to be honest with you. I really enjoy doing this. So
Yeah, so one concern I see come up when people are thinking about getting into stretcher is like the vehicles. Like if they want to
yeah,
be able to have the same vehicle do both wheelchair and stretcher without having to run back and take the equipment out and put it back in. If you're looking at something like a Ford Transit, that's going to be a lot more expensive than a Sienna. Can you fit a Traversa in sort of a conventional Sienna type wheelchair setup? Do you need a
yeah,
separate?
actually, that's an excellent question, because oftentimes we actually have to prove that. Like at a lot of the conferences where we go, you'll see us take our Traversa over to one of the vehicle manufacturers just to show them how easy it is. It's designed to fit in a standard wheelchair van, both the wheelbase length and width. Um, the benefit is it also fits on a powered platform. So if you are running big Ford Transit vans and you have other vehicles that you have to use in your particular market, we fit in those as well. We have, features that allow us to be able to, even a side entry minivan, it's not ideal, but our chair was designed to go in a side entry minivan on a side ramp and then be able to pivot sideways so we can actually face somebody forward in the proper way without having somebody get into workers' comp problems by trying to lift up the back of the chair. We have a pivot wheel underneath that makes it very convenient for them to be able to do that. So it's designed for just about every normal vehicle you would use. And in fact, I know that we've talked to one particular manufacturer, Broda, and they've created a specific NEMT package in their minivans that at some point will be purpose built for Traversa as well. I was just up there a week ago and we were talking about this and demonstrating it, how you can use one of their Striker stretchers in there, or you can use a Traversa in there with equal ease. And I think that will make the transition even easier and more convenient. It's a lot easier and it's a lot more versatile. Here's where I think we have the advantage. If you take a stretcher, it's really hard to go backwards into, just a standard wheelchair ride. If you have a Traversa, you can kind of go either direction, whether it's a wheelchair ride or whether it's a stretcher ride. We can cover a much bigger window of opportunity there, because we do hear that where you show up thinking you needed a wheelchair and it turns out to be a stretcher transport. Now you have to call somebody else and wait for them to schedule it and show up a couple hours later. With a Traversa, you're showing up and all of a sudden it turns into a stretcher ride. You're ready to go. Or all of a sudden, it didn't need to be a stretcher ride. They'd be much more comfortable sitting, where they can see the horizon looking out the front window. Hey, you got that covered too. You're perfectly fine in that situation.
Makes sense. So, I'm a dispatching software guy. And so, we've
Yeah.
spent a lot of time thinking about driver teams. Like, how do we set things up so people can run a schedule where you have two people, managing the stretcher, and then, one gets out and waits with the stretcher at the doctor's, other one goes off and does a wheelchair trip and comes back. We've got some great software features to support that, but
Yeah.
obviously it's a pain. You're paying for that second attendant. Um, and the Broda, as I understand it, can do, you only need one attendant. Is that right? Like, are there any
Yeah.
situations where you do need a second one? How do you think about it?
No, that's a great question. In fact, that comes up very often. Do I need to have two attendants? Can I do this with one? Truthfully, we say you can do these transports with one driver. It's just a wheelchair. Now, the caveat to that is when you're transferring somebody in and out of the chair, usually standard practice is you have two people being able to slide somebody from a bed onto a stretcher or from a bed onto our Traversa, because that's just safety. But once they're in the chair, it's easy to drop the whole center of gravity back down, position them, in a very comfortable fashion, and then just push it out as a wheelchair, in which case you just need one attendant. We'll always acknowledge there's going to be times where you need two. If somebody really is on the borderline, or in some cases it's either regional or legal reasons that they need to have two people, that's perfectly fine also. If you're the one doing the transfers in and out of the chair, it's good to have two people, unless you can rely on your nursing assistants at each end to help you with that transfer.
Got it. So talk to me a little bit about the cost of the Traversa versus a stretcher, both like upfront and maintenance over time.
Sure. That's a great question. This is where we get into the nuts and bolts. A Traversa right now costs $6,750, and that's literally on a pallet. You open the box, you pull it off, stick it in your van, and go. It's ready to go. There's no assembly required on that. A stretcher, even used stretchers, are going to be in the $12,000 range, probably double what the Traversa is. New stretchers are $16,000 to $18,000 unless you get really fancy, and that can go up from there. So from that perspective, the Traversa is a far more economical device, just as the device alone. Never mind your operating costs in a van and one person versus two, et cetera, et cetera. The maintenance, and Jing brings up, and I was just getting to that as well. I know that most stretchers come with a maintenance plan. Usually MSAR, one of the big companies like that, provides plans where they come in every 6 months, they do caster changes, they do whatever has to be done. And so that plan is oftentimes sold with the stretcher. Broda, we've been building chairs 45 years basically the same way. Everything on there, we always say do a functional check, just like you would your vehicle before you go out, just for safety. But basically everything can be adjusted with a hand tool or with your own hands. The positioning for the patient can be, everything on there is designed to make it comfortable with no tools involved for that particular patient. Maintenance, there's nothing to lube, there's nothing to replace every certain time period. Things happen, a cable might break on it because everything is manual and it's cable operated through pneumatic struts. If it breaks, just order another one. It's usually pretty inexpensive, and it's one screw at the top and then one hook at the bottom. Once you know how to do it, it takes you 30 seconds to replace a cable on something like this. If you have to replace one of the casters or one of the wheels, it's one bolt on each one. And if you have a decent tool set, it'll take you 3 to 5 minutes to do that. In fact, it usually takes me longer to get my tools lined up to do that. To Jing's point, the maintenance and cost, a cable can be, I want to say $25 or $50, something like that. And oftentimes, if it's under warranty, we just ship it to you FedEx, and you get it. Once you're out of warranty, in this case, our warranty is 2 years on the, or 5 years on the chair, 2 years on all the accessories around it. Generally speaking, everything is, $50 to a couple of $100 max, depending on the component that you have to replace. But you only replace it if it actually breaks. There's no time period. We do provide some checklists for our customers if they want to follow a regular maintenance period, which is always great practice. We can incorporate that. We've got those checklists for you where you can do all of this stuff. It's not like, I know, what is it? And please forgive me if I've got this price wrong, but I know like every 6 months you got to replace casters on a stretcher, and it's going to be like $600 or something like that, plus the cost of your maintenance plan, etc. In this case, no, none of that happens. If it breaks, we send you another one, and you're, back in business pretty quick. We've had some customers who have fleets of these chairs. They just buy some extra parts to keep on hand. And if something goes wrong, they already have the part, and then we just back it up with a warranty replacement behind it. So now they have it replenished on their shelf, ready to go again. So pretty easy.
So talk to me about insurance. One big expense with getting into stretcher trips is you have to pay for insurance that covers, stretcher loading and unloading. Does the Traversa, if you're using the Traversa for bedbound patients, do you have to buy the same level of insurance? Does it vary?
Are you talking about insurance for the operator or insurance for the person riding? Oh, for the operation, yes. So this is really interesting. From my understanding, again, I'm not an operator, but operating essentially what's an ambulance, if you're running stretchers or having two people, the insurance is probably going to be more than just a standard wheelchair van. It's going to be expensive no matter what. I mean, we've talked about that being, $1,000, $2,000 a month per vehicle. But if you're in those particular states where it has to be, at least basic life support in order to run a stretcher for non-emergency, that's when your costs really start skyrocketing from there. And that's where you have to have the reimbursement to be able to recover those costs. If you're able to do this as a wheelchair trip, obviously your costs are going to be much lower to begin with, and the ROI comes a lot sooner in something like this versus investing in a big box ambulance. I think Michael Shanks on this call, and he can probably attest, an ambulance is going to be, a couple $100,000 or something like that just to get into the ambulance, not including your operating costs, versus a wheelchair van that's at, yep, correct, there we go, about $60,000 to $80,000 for a wheelchair van and one person instead of two, and you're paying that person very different than an EMT. So yeah, and Erica pointed out very well that Monica and Jasmine from MJ Reliable, they run an NEMT academy for new operators, and they touched on that very recently on a video as well. So
great.
Yeah.
So question about training. Another sort of barrier to getting into stretchers is, how do I train my drivers to be able to safely operate this? What does training look like for the Traversa?
So that's a great question. One of the things I'll always do is I'll caveat this by saying I'm a big believer in NEMT accreditation and certifications. Always, yeah, I can see somebody commenting on that right now. I've personally done it. In fact, I'm in the middle of one right now. If you could see the tabs on my computer, you can see I've got one of the courses open that I'm doing as we speak. Best practices, especially standardized best practice where there's a process for safety and quality, is always going to be the best way to go. Fortunately, the Traversa itself is not a difficult device to learn. Once you understand how to operate the tilt and the recline and how to make it go up and down and just make comfortable adjustments for the passenger, it's really pretty intuitive. It's not that hard to figure out. The biggest challenge is if you think about it, safety comes in two ways. Number one is the comfort. If you have a patient or a passenger who's comfortable, they're not fighting their seatbelts, they're not trying to get out, especially memory care patients, it's already going to be a safer device. We help the patient to be comfortable by virtue of the way the chair is built, and also by virtue of the fact that we have, 4-point chest harness, we have a standard belt that's required as well. And by being able to tilt and recline, we can also create a natural barrier for a patient to try to crawl out of that chair themselves. If they need that chair, they really don't have the core strength to crawl out of it, versus a standard wheelchair where you could just slide right out if you hit some heavy braking, right? So, number two, the safety part comes, your driver can see if he didn't put the 4-point harness on. It's pretty obvious, and you can probably see it in the cameras in the vehicle. Same thing with the seatbelt. Same thing with the securement. There's 4 points on that chair to get securement from your Q straint or your bruns or whatever. If it is extremely obvious if you didn't connect to those, so that alone, just the safety factor by being able to visually see it as well as make the passenger comfortable are things that really contribute to, the business case for this particular device as well.
Yeah, so that's I mean a great summary over the last few minutes of sort of how much easier it is to use the Traversa to get into stretcher trips instead of doing it the old-fashioned way. I also want to touch on sort of the Traversa versus a traditional wheelchair, because part of the point of buying these things is so you're not always doing stretcher trips. Sometimes you're going to have someone who's in a wheelchair riding in a Traversa instead.
Yeah.
I've sat in a Traversa. You've been there, and I've said, "Wow, this is really comfortable. I like this. This feels a lot better than a traditional wheelchair." But I'm curious, talk to me a little bit about the experience of using and sort of the benefits to an NEMT owner of like having the wheelchair transport done in the Traversa versus a standard $300 wheelchair.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So by having a Traversa chair, kind of like what I was mentioning before, and we can go a little deeper on this, you have the versatility. If it turns out it's a wheelchair trip, no problem. You have it as a wheelchair. It just happens to be a lot more comfortable than the one that those guys are probably riding in. Same thing, if you show up and it's a stretcher trip, for non-emergency, there's a 90% chance you can still take that, and they're going to be happier for it because now they're not on a stretcher with two people chasing them down. What we've seen some of our operators do too is the flexibility to say to their passenger or to the facility that's requesting the ride, for safety purposes, we're putting them in our chair. We'll fold up the passenger's personal chair if they have one, stick it in the side, secure it someplace inside the vehicle, and they get it back after the trip is over. But at least for the time that they're in the vehicle, they're in a crash-tested wheelchair that's completely secured, and there's no question about the safety of that person's state during that trip. In fact, I always love talking about this. One of our operators told us that the best compliment they receive is when the driver can look in the rearview mirror and see the passenger asleep in the Traversa chair in the back. Those are the best rides for everybody. Nobody's fighting you, and they show up and they're happy. And especially in this day and age where facilities rely on all of the surveys and things like that for their reimbursement, the better the surveys and the happier their residents are in the facilities, the better off everybody else is, And so just that alone, we've had a couple of operators tell us that administrators love it because they get zero complaints, zero injuries, everybody's happy.
Oh yeah, we've talked about this in other podcasts. Like, it's so important to have people have a good ride. After that good ride, you say, hey, here's my link to leave a 5-star Google review. Like, you build up your reputation. The other facilities look at that. The other facilities talk to each other. Like, if you are constantly making your riders happy, like, it's going to benefit your business in many ways, in a compounding way over time.
We've even had operators help facilities use that as a marketing piece. Look how much we care about your loved one. We won't take them in these, unsafe rickety Walmart specials or, Walgreens special wheelchairs or whatever. We're actually concerned about their safety and their comfort. So we always call this type of operator that's going to bring this kind of chair to take your loved one to wherever it is that they have to go. And they use it as a marketing piece as well, and that helps them, especially when they're doing tours of the facilities for potential residents and stuff like that. It works really well.
So I've got just a couple more questions, and then we can open it up for the general audience.
Yeah.
What mistakes do you see people make when they're starting out with the Traversa? Is there any sort of words of wisdom or caution you might have?
Sure. The first thing I tell people, because I love going to train people myself, just because I love to see how different people do things across the country. So I'll go myself. But the one thing I always say when we start off is, I'm going to show you how to use this wheelchair and all the functions. We have a video starring our best inside sales rep Erica on this video, and she does a great job showing exactly how to use it. But practice on each other, because I'm telling you, nothing teaches you more than practicing on each other. You know, as Howard can probably attest in this video as well, when you're doing the certification courses, you know, for securement and things like that, part of the course is you go outside and you practice actually doing securement. You're not talking about it just in a classroom environment. You're actually practicing that procedure in person, because that's the only way to really learn how to do it. I've actually gone, perfect example, about a year ago, one of my customers came and we sat down just talking marketing strategy, and they brought their van with their Traversa inside, and I said, do I need to go get my Traversa? They said, no, let's go to dinner and we want you to ride in your Traversa. So I actually had them secure me in the Traversa. They put me in the back of the van and we went to dinner that way in their vehicle. And it feels, it's very rewarding to be able to be back there, carry on a nice conversation while you're sitting in this wheelchair in the back of their van in perfect comfort. You know, it was, but that's how you get good at it and adapt, because you don't want to try to learn how to use this wheelchair in front of somebody.
Right.
Because once you learn how to use it, and it becomes, you know, second nature, and everybody's used to it, and they start seeing it, they can, you know, certainly they can help you with it as well, because everything's adjustable to make the passenger as comfortable as possible.
So, good question from Jane here.
Yeah, say that.
Marketing collateral for providers to help, you know, nursing homes and other facilities understand and get comfortable with the Traversa.
That's actually one of my favorite questions, because yes, the short answer is yes. What we do as a courtesy for for any of our customers that ask for it is, you send me your logo, your website, and your contact phone number, and we can put it on just about any piece of collateral that we have for the Traversa. We have some that are specifically geared towards marketing your transportation service to long-term care facilities. And, you know, if you can pass that out, it's a one-sheet flyer front and back that shows the advantages of the Traversa, but it's co-marketed with your logo at the top. And, you know, I think even recently we just created one with a QR code as well. So that makes it even easier for people to be able to ask for your service. But yeah, we're happy to help you with that. We're doing one right now where, to create awareness, we designed a Post-it note that has the Traversa in all its various positions along the bottom with the provider's name and information on top. So that way, when you pass out these Post-it notes at, you know, the case managers or the, you know, discharge planners, it's pretty clear exactly what service that provider provides. You know, they're using Traversa, and here's the phone number, and you can stick it right on their computer screen or anywhere on their desk. And it's been a pretty effective piece of collateral as well.
I bet. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, what does it look like when someone gets into stretchers for the first time with a Traversa? What is sort of, you know, do you have some examples or a favorite service that started using it, and how did they go through the process, and like what was the outcome for them?
So there's so many wonderful success stories, but the one that always stands out to me is when we first released the Traversa. You know, we've had the previous model for years, and it's been used for years, and it's wonderful. But when we first came out with a Traversa that had a higher weight capacity, I got a phone call from one of the state veterans' homes in a different state. And they said, we would like to see this chair. And I said, sure, absolutely. So I went there, and this was going to be presumably our first customer. Their condition was they wanted to try it on one particular patient who was every bit of the weight capacity of that chair, and he was 6'7", happened to be nonverbal. And they had to Hoyer lift him into our chair. There was no way to do any kind of sliding transfer on this. So they Hoyer lift him into the chair. We got him strapped in. We had one of the attendants take him outside, probably a total distance of about 100 yards total, take them to the van that they use, lift them up, put them inside the van, and then just back them out, bring them back down, and take them back inside. At that point, I noticed one of the attendants crying, and I thought, man, did I do something wrong? I was trying to figure out what's going on, and I said, is everything okay? Because I noticed she's crying, and she said, that's the first time that guy's seen daylight in 2 years. And at that point, it's like, man, you don't forget that. And they needed it to be able to take him to his appointments at the VA hospital because they just couldn't get the doctors over enough times to be able to care for him properly. Now they take him anytime. In fact, I was just there recently. That was 2 years ago, and I was just there recently. Did a couple of adjustments on the chairs because they've all gotten some very heavy use, both figurative and literal. And but they're still working fine. And that, to me, that means more than anything. Somebody saw daylight for the first time in 2 years. That's pretty powerful. So,
yeah.
I wish they were all that dramatic, but you never forget that kind of stuff, So,
That's
but
amazing.
we've had so many operators tell us the same kinds of stories, man. They're able to take somebody long distance to a wedding that they would have otherwise missed because there's no way they could have afforded an ambulance to do it. Things like that happen every day, and I love it.
That's awesome. It's always nice to be helping people like that. So last question from me. What's the best way to order one of these things?
Well, the best way to order it is call us. So if you go to our website, and I think we have a link here to upload as well if we wanted to load that into the chat as well. But just call us. You'll be connected probably with Erica, and she is an expert at walking you through all of the steps necessary for this. And usually we try to keep these stocked. It's pretty easy to get the order in, and usually we can ship within 24 hours, and it'll arrive within 5 to 7 business days in most cases. So if you go to brodaseating.com/Traversa, I think there's a link that just popped up in the chat as well, but I think we have a special link also that we passed to you. Yeah.
If you click this link,
there it is, right there. Yeah,
that's Traversa off this webinar. Use that link, and then we'll know where you heard about it.
Yeah, absolutely. But from what I understand, I'm not too hard to find anymore on LinkedIn even. So send me a message, we'll connect, and we'll make sure and take care of you. But we have wonderful reps all over the country that can come out and show it to you. Schedule a time. They can help with training your folks once you get it, etc. So we try to provide as much support as we can from our local reps as well. So
great. So Abdul was wondering, is there a video where I can see the different angles of the chair and learn more about it?
Absolutely. And in fact, if you go to that link that's provided, you can see a video, I think, at the bottom of that page as well that shows that. There's and in fact, it's a training video that we've put together starring Erica, who's our fabulous inside sales rep, and you can find that on the Broda YouTube channel as well. Lots of places where you can see that. But Abdul, please feel free to reach out to us as well, and click on that link that James just put up there, and we'll reach out to you. We'll send you the information. Erica is wonderful about sending out links to testimonials, people who have used it, a lot of the training materials that we have as well. We're fortunate in that there's a lot of folks that have done testimonials for us, unpaid testimonials that really highlight their success with this chair. And we have some more coming up soon, folks that have just volunteered, hey, I'll do a testimonial for you, because we had one of our testimonials say that his ROI was under 6 months, and this other guy said, well, mine was under 2 months. So there, and so they've found their niche and they found their success with it, which we love to hear that. So
great. Any other questions? Feel free to just drop them in the chat there.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you for having me here, James. This has been fantastic. And, you always wonder, am I going to have enough to talk about to fill an hour? And it's like, no, let's go another hour, So.
Yeah,
I want to do
it's
that.
funny because I usually, I don't have people on to just, talk about how great their product is, but in this particular case, like, the Traversa chair is really, it's in a class of its own, and I've heard
Yeah.
so many people say so many good things about it that it's really great to like, have this time to chat with you about it.
Well, I appreciate it. And certainly our success comes from our inside team putting the chair together, but the chair came together because operators told us what they wanted. And we tried to incorporate that as much as we could. And there's going to be newer versions coming out in the next year, year and a half, that are going to be improvements, advancements. All of that comes because of our customers' feedback. We wish it would do this. Hey, that's a great idea. Let's figure out how to do that. And we start incorporating all those pieces. It just gets incrementally better every single time, and it's because of the people who trust us. So I wish we could take all the credit, but their success is our success.
Yeah. All right. Well, Ed, thanks again for being here, and thanks everyone for coming and watching live. And we'll post this video to YouTube shortly.
Thank you for having me. Great to
All
be
right.
here.
Bye, everyone.